Paul Ashby had been running scams for over a decade. He was meticulous, quick on his feet, and careful to never leave a trace. Over the years, he'd stolen thousands from gullible retirees, desperate single parents, and anyone naive enough to fall for his schemes. He thought he was untouchable, smarter than the police, more slippery than the law. But he had no idea the net was closing in on him. A week ago, Paul received an email from someone who claimed to be a potential business partner. The man, Alan, was looking for a new opportunity and had heard about Paul's success in various investment deals. The message was vague but enticing. Alan had a contact that owed him $50,000 in cash, but wanted to transfer it through a trusted third party, Paul. In exchange, Paul could keep 10% of the money, no strings attached. It was too good to pass up. Paul felt his heart pound with excitement as he replied, eager to seal the deal. 2 days later, Paul found himself standing in front of a nondescript house on the outskirts of town. The deal was simple: meet inside, collect the cash, and leave. No banks, no wire transfers, just cold, hard cash. The house was supposed to be vacant, Alan had said, but there was something about it that made Paul uneasy. He had always trusted his gut, and today it was screaming that something was off. Paul ignored the feeling. $50,000 was on the line. The door creaked as Paul entered the house. It was dimly lit, the air stale as if no one had lived there for years. He took a few steps inside and felt the weight of silence pressing down on him. The room was sparsely furnished, with nothing but a dusty couch and a single table in the center of the room. A black duffel bag sat on the table, clearly filled with something substantial. Paul's eyes widened. This was it, the money. His heart raced as he walked towards it. Suddenly, the sound of a door closing echoed from behind him. Paul spun around, his hand instinctively reaching into his pocket for the small knife he always carried. His eyes darted around the room, trying to identify the source of the noise. Before he could react, a man stepped into the light. He wasn't alone. 2 others followed him, their faces hidden in shadow.
"So what are you doing here tonight?"
the man in front said, his voice cold and steady.
"So you're here to steal from innocent people, huh?"
Paul's blood ran cold. Something was wrong. He turned back towards the bag, realizing too late that this was a trap.
"I think there has been some mistake,"
Paul stammered, taking a step back.
"What do you mean, mistake? You're here to take $50,000 from an old man."
The man replied, his voice unflinching.
"We are a unit that documents scammers and people with ill intentions over the innocent people. And if you won't answer our questions, we will have to call the police on you right now."
Paul's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd been so careful, so precise. How had they caught him? Who was this man, and why was he just standing there, staring at him like a predator cornering its prey?
"Look, I don't know what you're talking about."
Paul tried again, his voice cracking.
"I'm just here to pick up some money. That's all."
The man smirked.
"You think you're smart, don't you? Scamming people for years and getting away with it. But today, you're done."
The 2 other men stepped forward, hands reaching out to grab him. Paul panicked, his mind spinning out of control. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but he was trapped. Without thinking, Paul's hand clenched around the handle of the knife in his pocket. He yanked it out, his movements quick and erratic. His breath came in sharp gasps as he waved the knife wildly in front of him.
Stay back!
Paul screamed, his voice high and frenzied.
Don't come any closer!
The men hesitated, their expressions shifting from confidence to concern. For a moment, there was silence. Paul's heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. And then everything happened at once. One of the men lunged, and Paul reacted instinctively. The blade in his hand slashed through the air, connecting with the man's arm. Blood sprayed across the floor, and the man cried out in pain. Paul didn't stop. The fear that had been gnawing at him was replaced by a primal, uncontrollable rage. He slashed again, this time at the second man. The knife sank into his chest, and Paul felt the sickening crunch of bone beneath the blade. He pulled it out, blood splattering across his face, but there was no time to think. The first man was already on him, grappling for control. Paul's mind was a blur as he stabbed over and over, until the man's grip loosened and his body went to limp. The room was deathly quiet now. The only sound was Paul's ragged breathing and the distant echo of dripping blood hitting the floor. Paul stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring down at the bodies sprawled out around him. His mind raced to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing came. His hands were slick with blood, the knife trembling in his grip. He had killed them, they had set a trap, and he had killed them. Panic flooded his veins. He needed to get out now. Paul stumbled towards the door, nearly tripping over the lifeless bodies as he went. The knife was still in his hand, sticky with blood, but he couldn't let go. It was the only thing keeping him grounded in this nightmare. Outside, the cool night air hit his face like a slap. He gasped, his lungs burning with every breath. The world around him felt surreal, distant, like he was watching everything through a fog window. He had to get out of here, but where would he go? The police would come soon. They had probably been watching the house this whole time. It was a sting operation. After all, they had set him up. Paul's legs moved on their own, carrying him down the empty street. His thoughts spiraled out of control. He was supposed to be smarter than this. He was supposed to be in control. But now everything is falling apart. As Paul stumbled through the deserted neighborhood, flashes of the blood-soaked room flickered in his mind. He could still feel the warm spray of blood on his skin, the weight of the knife in his hand. It was all so vivid, so real. And yet it didn't feel real. None of this felt real. The street lights cast long shadows on the pavement, twisting and warping like something out of a nightmare. Paul blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the shadows remained. They seemed to move, crawling towards him, growing larger and darker with every step he took. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone or something was following him. The air around him was thick with tension, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. Paul's thoughts raced, his mind unraveling as paranoia set in. What if the man he killed weren't really dead? What if they were still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike? He spun around, knife in hand, but the street was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, far away from where he stood. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stop, not now. Paul's legs carried him further into the night, but he had no idea where he was going. The streets blurred together, every house looking the same, every shadow a reminder of what he had done. His mind was a whirlpool of fear and confusion. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't breathe. Suddenly, a car's headlights flashed across him, and Paul froze. The vehicle slowed as it approached, and for a moment, he was paralyzed with fear. Was it the police? Were they coming for him? The car passed without stopping, but the moment it was gone, Paul's panic exploded. He sprinted down the street, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from this place, away from the scene of the crime. He could still see their faces, the men he had killed. Their lifeless eyes, their blooded bodies. They would never leave him. He would never escape them. Paul stumbled to a stop, his body shaking with exhaustion and fear. He was lost in the streets, lost in his mind. He had thought he was invincible. He had thought he could outsmart anyone. But now, standing alone in the darkness, Paul realized the truth. He had trapped himself. There was no escape. Not from the police, not from the guilt, not from the madness clawing at his mind. As the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, Paul stood on the edge of a bridge, looking down at the cold, dark water below. His hands were still stained with blood, his clothes soaked with sweat and fear. He could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming for him. It was only a matter of time. Paul's grip tightened on the knife in his hand. He had no way out, no plan, no escape. So without hesitation, he jumped and reached the bottom of the bridge. As well as the end of his life, scamming people is never something that you will get away every time. There is always someone that's 2 steps ahead of you. Thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like and subscribe. I will see you again next week.